Good morning, everybody. We're gonna wait for 1 minute more and then we're gonna start. Thank you everyone for being here today. We are very excited to have this talk. The name is Kedai-Kedai Merdeka, Creolizing Typography. And it's a very interesting project about a typeface that considers how Latin alphabet can be inflected by aesthetics of non-Latin. So it would be reverse of what happens to many scripts. So I'm very excited to see this talk. We are gonna have this talk by Sueh Tan. She's a type designer, former type of media student, and she is a type designer specialized in non-Latin scripts. And Hao Tan, a multidisciplinary artist, mostly working with installation and performance art. So I hope you enjoy this talk, and I hope we can have a very nice Q&A afterwards and ask all our questions. Thank you very much.
Hello, we are Huruf, a type collective from Malaysia. I am Shirley, the founder of Huruf and also type designer.
Hello, I'm Zihao, a researcher of Huruf. I recently completed my PhD in Southeast Asian Studies.
Well, let me introduce ourselves a little bit. We are a type collective that strives to encourage greater awareness in typography and type design in Malaysia. There are two parts of presentation for today. So Zihao will be presenting the first part. So now I will pass over to Zihao now.
Hello, our presentation, Kedai-Kedai Merdeka, Creolizing Typography, is divided into two parts. The first part is about creolizing typography, and the second part, we will be introducing a font that Sueh has designed, which is called Kedai-Kedai Merdeka. So I'll be talking about this, the first part, the first segment, creolizing typography. Right, this segment aims to provide an overview to Malaysia's multilingual environment. And this background is important as it provides a kind of foothold to what Sueh will be presenting later. Before we begin discussion on typography, I think it is imperative to have some understanding on the context in which multiple languages are being spoken and represented in Malaysia, because it's against this context that we attempt to experiment with typography, with what we call typographic realization. So just so you know, Malaysia is located in Southeast Asia, north of Singapore, south of Thailand. Now you might have come across some tourism adverts which brand Malaysia as the tropical country that is truly Asia. It's forward-looking, modern, as signified by the Petronas Twin Towers and the KL Tower in the background. And the country is very diverse in culture, ethnicity, and languages. What you see here is only what is being represented in the mainstream media, of course. There are 5 main ethnic groups: the Malay, Chinese, Indian, Kadazan, and Dusun people, dressing in traditional clothing. Obviously, this is not how we usually present ourselves in the everyday life. But yes, Malaysia is definitely a very diverse place with over 100 languages in different localities. The main languages are Malay, Chinese, English, Tamil, also Malayalam, Bengali, and Punjabi. And in each language, there are always regional variations, and they are not always mutually intelligible. So just to give a sense of history, here are some photos. This is in Penang during colonial times when when Malaysia was ruled by the British colonial government. Right, back then it's called the British Malaya. You can see the generous display of multilingual signage throughout the entire street. Right, Penang was one of the street settlements. It is basically a colonial administrative city, and it has a very diverse and cosmopolitan population. And this is in Singapore. And like Penang, Singapore was another British street settlement. So it also has a very diverse, cosmopolitan, linguistically and culturally diverse population. If you take a closer look at this picture, above you can actually see a signage, a multilingual signage of a tailor shop rendered in 3 different scripts, right? The Latin, Chinese, as well as Arabic script. Right? The Arabic script is commonly used for the Malay language. Now, depending on the shop owners and their clientele, the translation varies, right? So if you have Malay and Chinese customers, you will have to translate your shop name into these 2 different languages, right? But if you are an Indian shop owner, for instance, very likely you will include the Tamil language because most Malaysian Indians came from southern India, Tamil Nadu. So generally, different industries would have different combinations of languages, different variety of multilingualism, and different preference for translation. And here, more examples. We have one photo taken on a polling day in 1955 and another during a protest in 1957. Malaysia attained its national independence from the British only in 1957. So obviously it is important for these political events to provide translation in multiple languages because you need to communicate to a wider audience. For the protests, you need to make yourself heard by various parties. You can see on the protest placards on your right, there are actually messages rendered in Malay, Chinese, Tamil, as well as English. Now, the situation today is not that different. Multilingual signage remains quite prevalent throughout Malaysia. But of course, after decades of independence, a lot more people were formerly taught Malay as well as English. So people tend to speak these two languages when it comes to when they exchange in public arena. And also for political reasons, multilingualism has often been regarded as something that works against the unity of the country, right? There's this presumption that everyone needs to, that everyone, every citizen would have to speak the one and only national language, the Malay language. And it's believed that if everyone is allowed to speak the communal tongue, then unity is deemed as unattainable. So throughout the history of colonial Malaya, multilingualism is a very complicated issue. It's often fraught with tension and conflicts. Now let me just focus on one particular case, one particular industry. These are photos of the Chinese pawn shops that have existed since colonial times. You can see that pawn shops usually have a multilingual facade because they cater to different ethnic groups. They have a cross-sectional customer base. Generally, pawn shops were considered as the poor man's bank or the bank for the unbanked. And most of the time, the customers were the working class. And this class, of course, cuts across conventional ethnic division. But today, multilingual typography is sometimes romanticized. It is very evocative of nostalgia. It is also seen as a symbolic token of cultural inclusivity, of cultural tolerance, because the message is translated into different linguistic registers and everyone will be able to understand it. So there's always this romantic sense that translation helps to render information transparent and much more legible. But this is often a myth. And one need only to look at the tickets issued by pawn shops in the early 20th century to understand how multilingual translation is insufficient to address the problems of inter-ethnic communication. These are all some examples of the pawn tickets issued by pawn shops. The earlier pawn tickets on the left only contain the Chinese text, but the later ones on the right have multiple languages. Now, at that time, the colonial government actually required all pawnbrokers to translate all essential information to their non-Chinese customers in order to prevent information asymmetry and potential double dealings. So there were customers, particularly non-Chinese ethnic groups, protesting against the Chinese pawn shops. They lodged complaints against them because the customers couldn't understand the tickets. And some pawnbrokers, not all, but some, took advantage of that. So under the colonial administration, translation became mandatory. As you can see, on the pawn tickets, the printed text was arranged in a grid format, neatly presenting every single translation. And the grid here functions as a system of order and also as a system of hierarchy. The English language is always positioned at the top, and it is the language of the colonial power, from which the rest must translate and relay. But despite the effort to make information transparent across different language communities, something escapes translation. Now, the Chinese pawnbroking industry actually has a way of writing that selectively reveals information to insiders, but conceals certain information to outsiders. Right? So even if you can read Chinese, it doesn't mean that you can actually interpret this Chinese handwriting. Right? If you can see from these two images, the central columns represent the common Chinese characters, which can be easily read and understood, whereas flanking at the side of these of these two images, you can find the cursive script of the Chinese characters. And these are very difficult to read, and they are ciphered language, right? The way the pawnbrokers would write these messages is that they intentionally write it in this manner so that it will conceal certain important information from the customers. But anyone who's trained in this pawnbroking industry will be able to understand the way it's being written, right? They'll know that a particular cursive characters should be written in a particular way, right? This, of course, the industry has this method of writing because they wanted to, just in case if you are in a negotiation, if you're discussing about the price of your customers' pledge items, if you're discussing the price of it with your colleagues in the in the pawn shop, then it is ciphered in a particular language that the customers that is at the front desk will not be able to understand exactly how you negotiate with the price, right? So this becomes quite important because it develops a better rapport, right? If you reveal every single information about the details of your discussion about the price, the value of the customer's assets, then it might offend the customers who are bringing their items and bringing their assets and trying to pawn it. Right, so now this system of writing is unique to the pawnbroking industry. It was established way back in China, but again, there are different localities and each has distinctive variation. And as a researcher myself, I'm still struggling to understand the handwriting, but I think there's something potentially creative, something playful, perhaps even cunning in this quirky historical account. Now imagine as translators, how would you translate something that refused to be understood? How would you translate a script that is intended to misdirect, or even a handwriting that is intended to miscommunicate, right? And as you can see in the previous examples where the colonial government attempts to translate every single essential information on pawn tickets, you can notice that there are certain things that has escaped translation, right? That has escaped the colonial optic. So on this multilingual pawn tickets, we are actually confronted with the limits of multilingual typography. Right, despite efforts of translation, something remains intentionally and strategically untranslatable. And this untranslatability lies not in the Chinese language itself, because even proficiency in Chinese does not guarantee comprehension of these words. This untranslatability lies in the script. It is a form of encryption, right? There's a hidden code, there's a cipher. And this is where I think typographers and type designers could gain something out of this historical account. If we can see the script or the handwriting as a language of a language, as a code of a code, then type designers are essentially translators. So, but instead of translating a language, right, type designers translate a script or writing system. Type designers translate the graphic or the typographic elements that represent the language. And this is where the notion of creolizing typography becomes relevant. As an approach, it is a response to the complex and layered history of multilingual typography in Malaysia. And the word Creole is typically used in the field of sociolinguistics to refer to a combination of languages that occurred in colonial contact zones. It's a mixture, it's a product of linguistic hybrid. By using the term creolization in the field of design and typography, we are also interested to probe the limits of linguistic translation. Right? There's something that has escaped translation. There's something that can be translated meaningfully, but when it comes to the writing system, there's something, the complexity of the form, the complexity of the representation of language escapes the linguistic translation. So we wanted to explore the possibility of conceiving a typographic translation, right? And the font that Sueh has designed, which is called Kedai-Kedai Merdeka, is really an exemplification of this philosophy. It is a typographic experiment that questions the colonial legacy of divide and rule as evident in multilingual typography. So creolizing typography as an approach has several implications. First, we want to see typography as a language of a language, because typography essentially is the visual language of a language. Therefore, any attempt at translating a language, we think, should also take into consideration the extra-linguistic elements of a language. By extra-linguistic, I mean concerns that deals with the representation or the graphic form of the speech or the verbalization of language, that is the text itself, right? So in this sense, typography is a practice of translation, and image makers, be it designer or artists, could play a potentially radical role in the hermeneutics of translation by investing greater attention on the extra-linguistic, the graphic, as well as the typographic. So in the next segment, Sueh will explain her creative process in designing the type, Kedai-Kedai Merdeka, especially on how she departs from the historical context of multilingual translation. And more importantly, how she attempts to incorporate the aesthetic sensibilities of non-Latin scripts to the Latin typeface. Sueh?
So I will take over for the part 2 to speak about the making of Kedai-Kedai Merdeka. In earlier this year, we have the opportunity to participate in this exhibition, Solidarity Spores, that's happening in Gwangju in South Korea. So we take the opportunity to experiment with typographic realizations when doing the artwork. And here is the brief from the curators, Suki Amin and Tatsuya Goto. They threw us some good questions like, what is the common written language for East Asian graphic designers? So obviously, Latin alphabet would be the closest answer. But how is the Latin alphabet from Malaysia different from other countries? Let's take a look at our typography landscape. So these shophouse signages from between 19th to 20th centuries, they are particularly multilingual and multiscript. This is because of the multiracial population that was emerged due to the British colonialism and migration. Our Latin is never lonely. They always coexist with other scripts. So condensed Latin forms are commonly seen here, especially on multilingual signages in Malaysia. They were used to typeset Malay and English short names that usually pair with Chinese characters that have a shorter width. And different scripts usually influence each other. This is a good example of typographic realization. As you can see, the Latinized Tamil here. So there is Sans-Serif in Tamil that was influenced by the Latin. And here is another example, Arabic size Latin. Let's take a closer look. So the letter form is kind of fluid and organic. And some letters are connected, for example, the C and H, and also E and N. The dots on the I and the E was reminiscent of the diacritic marks on Arabic letters as well. And distorted letters are very common here. Imagine we have to fit so many languages and scripts into such a tiny space in the signage. So those are our observations on the Latin alphabets from Malaysia. So we would like to incorporate those into a Latin typeface that was influenced by the aesthetic sensibilities of non-Latin script in Malaysia. So fit into a space flexibly together with other scripts, and we hope to challenge the divide and rule policy and also portray the inclusive and tolerance, like how multiracial people here can get along well harmoniously. We took Kedai-Kedai, one of our typeface, to further explore on the idea. So Kedai-Kedai means shophouses in Malay language. Let me give you some context of this typeface. It was inspired by the vernacular signs in Malaysia. The uniqueness of this typeface generally inspired by the unusual letter form that we observe from the signages. And then from there, we developed Kedai-Kedai Merdeka to experiment with typographic realization. Merdeka means independence from colonialism and narrow dogmatism in Malay language. And here is the initial sketches of Kedai-Kedai Merdeka to explore different ways of coexistence. As you can see, the Latin alphabets kind of borrow the typographic morphology from Jawi, which is Arabic Malay, Chinese, and Tamil. It is Latin typography that tries to adapt the behavior of Arabic, Tamil, and Chinese. And first, I will go into details. So you adapt the fluid connection and organic behavior of Arabic. The typeface enables different glyphs to conjoin that form unusual ligatures in some letter combinations like K and E, O and P. You also have different levels of ligatures that show different levels of fluidity and legibility. And the texture is kind of like organic and fluid. For example, the letter R, the leg of the letter R bends upwards like the Jawi final alif. We also explore on the variable ligature that try to fit in a multilingual space flexibly. We also adapt the hook design details into some letters like K and R that is adapted from the Arabic. So next, curvilineal texture of Tamil was adapted into Latin as well. So if you look at the earlier manuscript, they were usually written on the palm leaf. So to avoid the palm leaf easily tear off, the strokes are very curvy. For example, if you see the stem of the A, it forms a loop there that is reminiscent of Tamil strokes. And lastly, we also adapt the logographic and modularity of Chinese into Latin. So we try to fit the alphabets into block that reminiscent the pictography of Chinese character. So as you can see, this is terima kasih. It means thank you in Malay language. And here is some other words like common, alphabet, familiar, and alien. And this is the last exploration, which is a monospace version that was meant for vertical reading. And it was inspired by the Latin that was set in vertical direction like these two signages, which originally was inspired by the Chinese sign on pillars with plaster relief that was shown by Zihao in his earlier presentation. So after that, I mixed all the explorations into this text specimen wall graphic. And the layout is kind of follow the shop front layout, like the shop, this. And inside this wall graphic, there's also a 300 words essay written by Zihao on his research on typographic realization in Malaysian context. And this is how the artwork looks like in the exhibition. So, to conclude, what Kedai-Kedai Merdeka tries to show is that typography could play a more important role in aesthetic of translation. And by translation, it doesn't mean that the translation from one language to another language. It's more like from one script to another script. And creolizing typography is really about the translation of the visual language of a language. As a type collective coming from a multilingual environment, we're interested in how a multilingual typographic landscape could inspire and challenge the way we approach type design and typography. And this typeface not only allows us to explore the uniqueness of each script, but also the common share across the differences. On top of that, we also try to convey a political statement, especially during this moment of crisis, in order to show the importance of being together and cohabitation. So what can we learn, unlearn, relearn from each other? What can we translate? How can we relate to each other? What other forms of creoles can we create? We hope that through such experiments of creolizing typography, we could begin to understand that as humans, we are always already creolized. That's all with our presentation. Thank you.
It was very interesting. Would you like to explain something else, or does anybody have any questions so we can start the Q&A? I first wanted to say that I was very looking forward to this talk, especially because I feel like there's so many times that it happens the other way around with Latin and other scripts. So for me, it was very interesting to see how visually that would express being the other way around. And it was very impressive. Like I thought I don't know, I wasn't expecting the result, but I really enjoyed it. So I thought it was a very interesting research and a very interesting approach to typography. So congratulations.
Thank you.
Oh, you cannot hear me? Can you hear me? Oh, David asked if it's been distributed as a font somewhere.
Not yet. Yeah, still in progress.
Will it be? Will it be distributed? Or
yes, since we are working towards it.
oh, okay.
I mean the first version, the Kedai-Kedai, already kind of distributed, like kind of soft launch, but not the Kedai-Kedai Merdeka version yet.
So we can look forward to it.
Yeah.
Then Irmi asked, thank you very much. You mentioned that translation and multilingualism is romanticized. Can you explain on that?
Well, I think most of the time in Malaysia, when multilingual translation is used, it is often used on like in this recent decades, like there are a lot of hipster cafes that they like to have multiple scripts, multi-scriptural typography, multilingual signage in front of their facade, and that is something that is quite recent. So there's this trend of late that designers tend to incorporate multiple languages to indicate a certain kind of national identity that every different racial categories, different racial groups can sort of come together. So in that sense, there's a romanticization of this multilingual typography. But at the same time, if you look at history of colonial Malaya, right, this aesthetic of presenting multiple language in one particular design format has a very colonial history, right? Because it was back in the late 19th century and early 20th century that multilingualism began to become in vogue. And that period was a time when the colonial administrator wanted to present themselves as a government that is inclusive, right? So there's this history that we have to be aware of, right? And a lot of designers who use multilingual typography today, they tend to use it in a way that refers back to that nostalgia, that period. So there's a little bit of sentiment of nostalgia in that. They would intentionally make the signage look old, invoking memories of in the 1950s. So in that sense, it's romanticized. So I think this project is also trying to challenge that romanticism. Yeah, we're trying to break certain boundaries, trying to befuddle certain racial categories. In Malaysia and also in parts of in Singapore, it's often seen that there are a limited set of racial categories like Chinese, Malay, and Indian, and the rest, right? But it is much more diverse than that. So that's what we're trying to question as well.
It's a very interesting approach to it. David also asked, what's the plan for its future use?
I mean, as we have mentioned just now, we plan to distribute it. But then recently, there is a designer bought the work in progress typeface from us, which is the curator of the exhibition, Sueh and me. And then they actually use it in the very perfect context because they are designing independent publishing exhibition in South Korea, but then in Asia for the publisher in Asia. So they would like to use this Kedai-Kedai Merdeka because it's related to the context, and they use it in like such a perfect way that we love it very much. Yep.
That's so nice. People are saying thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting. I see that you have some materials. Is there something that you would like to explain?
I think, Shirley, would you like to explain a little bit more about the first version of Kedai-Kedai font? Right, that's before it develops into Kedai-Kedai Merdeka. That font in its original form is actually being distributed, right?
Yes, and it was, yeah, it was, yeah, we have published it, I mean, last year through, we also published a zine, risograph zine, together with the typeface, but I don't have any picture right now.
The zine is called Towards Vernacular Typography, so it's a different kind of project. Kedai-Kedai Merdeka was really trying to expand from that.
That's nice. Do you have a presentation about this here?
No,
No, I mean, you have the material here. I'm not asking for anything else. Don't worry. Just if you want the visual support. Here. Okay, great. So, do you think that since the project was to see how Latin was affected by the other three scripts, do you think that if you would do the same thing but to other scripts, like for example, take Arabic and see how the other three scripts affect on it, you would have different results? Or is that something that you would consider exploring? I mean, I know that the basic is like Latin as the source of all the South Asia resources, but would that be an experiment that would be interesting to perform afterwards?
Yeah, actually it's part of our interest because before this Kedai-Kedai Merdeka, we already started some explorations on some hybrid platforms that mix all the Malaysian scripts together and form something new. And then I think Zihao did some nice hybrid platforms out of it, which only can be read if all the Malaysians like comes together. Yeah, so we did this kind of experimentation through the workshops together with the students as well.
For that experiment, I think mostly it's using Chinese characters as a base, right? Because the morphology of Chinese characters is that they're usually compound characters, in the sense that some of them are pictographs, ideographs, but not all. So we can, because it's an image, it's a graphic by itself, so we can actually insert different alphabets, Latin alphabets in particular, into these different parts of the character, different components of the character. So that is a different experimentation. We're trying to incorporate other elements into Chinese characters, whereas for this Kedai-Kedai Merdeka, it's really about incorporating other scripts into the Latin typeface.
Nice. They are asking if Saba asked if she has other places where she can learn more about the project, because she's interesting to find out about that.
Yeah, I mean, currently we only have social media, so I typed the link there already in the chat room.
But I'm expecting that once this is released, it will be, the whole investigation behind it would be around, right?
Yeah.
Irmi asked, how many scripts do children in school in Malaysia learn?
So how?
Well, most of the time it's the Latin script, which is used for Malay, the national language of Malaysia, as well as English. But we also have this policy called we have this educational policy of bilingualism. So different citizens, depending if you're a Chinese, then or if you're an Indian, then you're able to study also the Tamil script and the Chinese characters. So it really depends. If you are, say, if you are a Chinese, if you come from a Chinese-speaking background, then most likely you'll be learning two scripts. That is the Latin script as well as the Chinese script. But if you're a Malay, unless you take an additional language course to study Chinese or Tamil language, then you'll be learning an additional script. If you're not, then it's just Malay and English. Then you'll be learning two languages but one script. And this Malay language itself has a very interesting history too, because prior to the Latinization of Malay language, which happened around in the 1920s, I think another speaker, Derek, also spoke about the Latinization of the language in Turkey, which happens around in the 1920s. So the same thing happened in Malaysia. We have this Latinization of the Malay language. Before that, Malay language was actually rendered in the Arabic script, which is called Jawi, right? And as I've indicated, and Sueh's font has also demonstrated that there were elements of Arabic script in there. So that was from that part of history. But of course, as is mentioned in the talk, is that this idea of learning different languages is a very complicated issue. It's a controversial issue in Malaysia, because even in, I think this year, there was this controversy that is before the COVID-19. Of course, COVID-19 ended everything. Before the COVID-19, there were controversies about because the Ministry of Education wanted to introduce the learning of the Arabic script, right? But the Arabic script is often seen as something that is affiliated solely to Islam. So there were non-Muslims who were being a little bit Islamophobic. So they think that it's kind of an Islamization process in Malaysia. But that was actually, of course, an assumption that is made by the non-Muslims. So it was highly politicized. The idea of learning a particular script is highly politicized in Malaysia. And in some parts of Malaysia, the state government also make it compulsory for shop owners to actually have the Arabic script, right, on top of their shop. So apart from just Latin script, apart from just Chinese characters, you must have the Arabic script. So some would just incorporate it on top of it. They designed the entire signage, but because of this regulation, so they just added something on top of, above the existing design. So it looks kind of funny, a little bit kitschy there. But that's the state of affairs in Malaysia today, yeah.
That's so interesting. I didn't know it worked like that. It only says great. Does anyone else have any questions? Any more questions? Satoru says it's a fascinating story. It is, actually.
Okay, show some examples, some images from a file they have uploaded if we have time.
Yeah, I think we have time if you would like that, yes.
Let me see if it works.
Seems to be working. Yes, perfect.
Can you see the slides?
Yes, we can.
All right, this was a talk that that we gave earlier this year. It's about multilingual typography, but it's about unity that splits, right? Because multilingualism is seen as something that is unifying, but actually it's a controversial issue, so it's less unifying, but it's a splitting matter. I'm going to show you some images where the Arabic script was imposed on an existing signage. Are you able to see the slides? I think it's still loading.
We are currently seeing an Arabic newspaper, I'm gonna guess to say. Now we're
okay. All right. Seems to be still loading on my part. Hold on a second. Okay. So just to give you an example, you can see, for example, this one. This is an old image of a shop house, but if you come here, you'll see that how it evolves. It becomes multilingual after that, right? In the 1937, it's just 1 to 2 languages, and in 2011 there are more languages, right? Because of state regulation. Because state regulation requires that you have different scripts, different languages on the signage. This is an example that we showed in the slides. This is in the shop is established in 1952, and you can see that the Tai Sin pawn shop, they have this facade on top that is old. But now you can see that they have this change. 1950s it was this, and in present days it's just basically a digitally printed signage with the Malay language on the left. And so this was the old design format for pawn shop signage, and this one is the latest one. Right, you can see it's very postmodern, and they just stretch, enlarge the entire Malay language pajak, right? Because the Malay language has to be dominant, and it looks less multilingual today, right? Because bear in mind that, as I mentioned earlier, multilingual is a kind of it's part of the colonial history. So to some extent, the government today are trying to resist against that colonial multilingual tendency. They're enlarging the Malay word. So to show you examples of how the Jawi script was imposed, right? You can see on the right, right, there is this signage. The original signage in yellow is just Ban Sun Hin, but the Jawi script was imposed on top, right? Because state regulation requires that, right? On the left is basically just a news cutting. So that is how it is being incorporated into it. It's not part of the design consideration, as you can see. It's just laying there on top of the signage. Yeah. So that's all. How do I close it? Yeah.
That's very interesting how they just try to push it in like, yep, I'm following the law.
Yeah.
And I also found very interesting when you were commenting in your talk about this kind of script that pawn shops did, that it was not meant to be read, not meant to be understood. I find that concept very interesting, like, because usually it's for the opposite. It's to be understood and to be read and to be like a notification of something that is happening, but that they would use it as a benefit to be like, yeah, we're in the middle ground here. I find it very, I would have never said that existed, actually.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because, as you know, as designers, you are visual communicators. You communicate through visuals, and that is where there's a communication breakdown, and it's part of the strategy of communication, right? What would happen if to miscommunicate is part of the strategy of communication? How would you incorporate that into typography? It is part of the strategy. I think it's not just this idea that you need to conceal certain information from your clients is actually quite common in a lot of pawn shop in pawn shop industry across the globe, right? It's not just among Chinese pawnbrokers that they do this, right? In America and in other parts of area, there are other ways of concealing information, but it's only in the Chinese pawnbroking industry that they conceal the information in the character itself. Right. In others, you will be using a different substitute. For instance, you would say a different word, but that particular word actually means something else. So there are different kinds of encryption that happens in the pawnbroking language system. So just to give you an example, for pawn shop, in Chinese pawn shop history, Like if you give them, if your pledge item happens to be a new gold wristwatch, right? They would say that it's not gold. They would say that it's bronze, and they would say that it's actually old. It's not new, right? They would write that on the pawn shop ticket. So you will not be able to actually read that. That is how they evaluate your item, right? Because you can't actually read the script, but that is how they do it, right? And that is to give them some leeway, some flexibility, so that in return, when you are coming to reclaim your item, just in case if there's any, if the item was spoiled, then there's a bit of space, room for argument that your items were already spoiled when you gave it to us. Yeah.
Very interesting. Very sneaky.
Yeah.
David says it might be interesting to publish a study of the pawn shop script.
Yeah, it's I'm working on that research at the moment. The pawn shop tickets is actually part of research for the history of multilingualism in Malaysia. So the pawn shop is the first case study. The second case study is actually barbershop. We're looking into also Indian barbershops and see how Indian barbershop owners incorporate other scripts as well. So there are 2 case studies. So what I presented here is just the first of the 2 case studies.
Oh, nice. Interesting. Great. Does anybody else have any more questions? Because we're running out of time. So this is the last moment to make them. Thank you very much. Oh, Irmi asked have you published your sources?
Not yet, but there's a very brief article that I'm working on. It will be published next year, I think in January. It's also it'll be published in a design magazine by another design studio in Malaysia. Hopefully by next year.
Great.
Yeah. Just feel free to follow our Facebook group, Huruf. Probably if there's anything that's related to this, then we'll post it there if it's published.
We can stay updated with the project. Great.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for everyone who attended, and thank you both of you for this great talk. It was very interesting, and we hope to see you in the next talk around here in ATypI. Thank you for coming. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.